Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. I have a very nasty habit of starting things and never finishing them. Just look at all the book series I've reviewed one or two books from and then take years to finally get to the rest of them. I really should finish off that first Shatnerverse trilogy, shouldn't I? But one of those things that I started and never finished was a look into the works of H.P. Lovecraft, way back in, oh geez, was it really 6 whole years ago already? 2015, I took a look at The Call of Cthulhu, one of Lovecraft's most well-known short stories, but I didn't actually intend for that to be my first foray into his bibliography. No, I actually intended to look at Herbert West Reanimator, mainly because I was aware of it by reputation, because I've heard of the cult classic film series based on it starring Jeffrey Combs. But, on recommendation from a friend who was way more of a fan of Lovecraft than I was, they advised me to start with Cthulhu and work my way up, since Cthulhu is much more indicative of Lovecraft's usual style, and Reanimator was more of a departure from it. So, I reviewed it, and apart from a single Lovecraft story, The Rats in the Walls, which I had to read for a creative writing class I took in college, I never read another Lovecraft story, instead turning my attention to other horror authors like William Peter Blatty and Stephen King. Until now, of course, because today's story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, comes highly recommended from my cousin, who picked up a collection of Lovecraft stories in preparation for a session of the Call of Cthulhu tabletop game he is running for a tabletop group on Halloween, and while I already have a Halloween movie picked out, I figured we ought to do a book review too, and now was good enough a time as any to reopen the Book of Lovecraft. Written in 1931, The Shadow over Innsmouth is actually a pretty good second story for me to look at because it builds upon the Cthulhu mythos introduced in The Call of Cthulhu. So, let's not waste any more time and get right into it. This is The Shadow over Innsmouth. Or is it Innsmouth? Unlike most other Lovecraft stories, this one was actually the only one to be published as a book during his lifetime, having initially been intended to appear in Weird Tales, but was rejected on the grounds of being too long to publish in one part and not having a discernible midpoint for which to divide the story into multiple parts. The cover is, well, it's not great. It's just an illustration, no doubt faded due to the age of the book in the image, with the title up top and the author's name running down vertically on the side, which I actually like. It's an interesting way to do it. As for the illustration itself, it's an image from very late in the novel of the main character looking over the city of Innsmouth from above, and is rather striking. So the image is a great choice for the cover, it's just that it's not super compelling in its unrestored state. Let's get to the story itself. The story follows our unnamed narrator as he goes on an architectural tour of New England, and while I don't usually think of that as exciting and compelling storytelling, let's see where he goes with it. Actually, I misspoke a bit. It started out as a architectural tour, but it ended with giving testimony to the government that ended with the town being half destroyed, its inhabitants arrested and imprisoned, and something being fired upon by submarine torpedoes. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The narrator, who's from Ohio, started out in New England on a part sightseeing, part genealogical tour of the area, going from the real Newburyport to the fictional Arkham, where his mother's family was from. The narrator, always a frugal customer, balked at the expensive train ticket, leading to the ticket agent suggesting that he instead takes the much cheaper bus that passes through Innsmouth on the way to Arkham. Innsmouth intrigues the narrator, not only because it doesn't appear to be on any maps, which is why he'd never heard of it before, but because it also inspires a sense of dislike from all those in the neighboring towns. The prevailing theory on why they dislike Innsmouth comes down to rumors that the richest man in Innsmouth, Old Man Marsh, was into devil worship, not to mention that all the people have a strange look about them that turns most people off. The narrator does some research into Innsmouth around Newburyport, checking out the library and asking around the locals, but no one really wants to talk about it, and if they do, they just tell him not to do it. Like whenever you try to ask someone who's internet famous how to get started making internet videos. The history of Innsmouth goes as such. It was once a normal, prosperous town, but was hit hard during the War of 1812 because shipping got interrupted, and then Obed Marsh built a gold refinery that was profitable, but that wasn't enough to help the town because not long after, the town was hit with an epidemic in 1845, which wiped out half the town's population. The narrator has also shown some Innsmouth jewelry of strange and seemingly unearthly origin at the local historical society, curated by Miss Tilton, although they don't know much about it other than that it was pawned by an Innsmouth native shortly before they died and sold to the historical society, who have rebuked all offers from the Marsh family to purchase it, lending credence to a rumor that it might be related to an exotic pirate treasure hoard found by Captain Obed Marsh. Miss Tilton also sheds some light on the supposed devil worship and warns the narrator of the Esoteric Order of Dagon, a quasi-pagan society that took up during a time of downturn for Innsmouth and supposedly helped bring prosperity back to the town, but turned them a tad xenophobic, as they're very rude to outsiders. Despite all the warnings, though, the narrator goes there anyway, being almost drawn to the city and unable to sleep due to his excitement of his impending trip, like a kid who knows that the next day he's going to Disney World. The next morning, the narrator rides the bus up there, which proves to be a strange experience. I can relate, because I too took a cheap but unpleasant bus ride up into Boston once. Although things on my bus got weird halfway through Connecticut, so I don't know what the deal with that one was. The narrator notices the peculiar look and shambling gait of the driver and few other passengers who disembarked in Newburyport, it having earlier been explained that no one except Innsmouth folk ride the bus, and the narrator momentarily has pause, not wanting to be alone with the driver, but gets over himself and gets on. The ride is mostly uneventful until the bus reaches Innsmouth and the narrator gets a look at the city, which is a veritable ghost town with only a few strange-looking people out and about, what the narrator calls the Innsmouth look, and crumbling buildings. The narrator checks his bag at the hotel and goes on a wander, finding a recognizable chain grocery store and the only normal person in town, a clerk at the aforementioned chain grocery store. The narrator makes the acquaintance of the clerk, who appears to be normal, and that's because he's not a native, he just works in Innsmouth, since the chain he worked for opened a store in Innsmouth and he was transferred down there from Arkham. It makes one wonder why, given that it's a mostly deserted town whose people mostly keep to themselves, why a chain store chose to open in Innsmouth, or why they didn't just hire people in the town and chose to bus in their clerks, but that's a minor gripe. Also, it's just weird to think about chain grocery stores existing in the 1930s, because in my head, I've always just imagined that everything was mom and pop back then. The clerk is rather helpful, advising the narrator of what he's learned in his time in Innsmouth, such as them having no chamber of commerce or public library, and that they mostly stay inside except for two festivals, once on April 30th and the other on Halloween, which amounts to a lot of chanting. They're also very fond of the water and do a lot of swimming. The clerk also gives the narrator a hand-drawn map, pointing out places where the narrator should avoid, like the Church of Dagon, and tells him that if he wants info about the town, he should ask Zadok Allen, a drunk old sailor who was mostly tight-lipped until you get some liquor into him, and then he tells stories of old Innsmouth, although his stories are probably the ramblings of a madman. The narrator gets some cheese and crackers to serve as provisions during his trip, not wanting to eat at the hotel restaurant, which I was gonna crack a joke about how cheap he was being, but then I remembered that a box of these is what I took with me last time I was in Boston, so I'm just gonna shut up now. The narrator uses the map to navigate and finds some signs of life throughout the squalid and desolate town, but is unnerved by certain sounds that he hears that he describes as somewhat inhuman, but he doesn't notice any dogs or cats to justify non-human sounds. Which makes sense. Any discussion of Lovecraft usually leaves out mention of cats for obvious reasons. No, I won't say it. Go look it up for yourself. While passing a dilapidated firehouse, the narrator spots old Zadok Allen, and after heading into a liquor store, follows him in a bid to get a history lesson on the town. Although his story is history in the same sense that Ancient Aliens airs on the History Channel, at least seemingly based on what he describes. Zadok Allen fills in the gaps on the history of the town. Much like the Sign of the Four and other writings of the time, there's mentions of the savage tribes of the East, and this story is no exception, with Obed Marsh having discovered a tribe trading with the Deep Ones and offering sacrifices in exchange for riches, large fish hauls, and strange jewelry, which Marsh brought to Innsmouth to aid during their economic downturns. Of course, that wasn't a very popular idea, and Obed and his followers were arrested, leading to the death of half the town's population. Not a Thanos snap, but the Deep Ones retaliating and killing half the town. The survivors were absorbed into the esoteric order of Dagon and began breeding with the Deep Ones, which on the surface wasn't so bad. The babies still looked human, but much like the mermaids in the 13th Year or the leprechauns in The Luck of the Irish, and I don't know why I chose to specifically do 2 Disney Channel movies, age plays a part in it, and as the Innsmouth people get older, they start to become like the Deep Ones, and eventually go off to live under the sea underneath Devil's Reef, the Deep Ones being related to the greater Cthulhu mythos, as the mention of both Cthulhu and Relay are made in Zadok's ramblings. At present, the town is run by Obed Marsh's grandson Barnabas, who Zadok believes to be almost fully transformed into a Deep One. Zadok Allen also believes that the Deep Ones aren't content with what they have, and intend to take over the surface as well, but that's about all the narrator gets out of him because he starts screaming at the narrator to get out of town as fast as possible and runs off, never to be seen again by the narrator. The narrator is obviously a tad perturbed by that episode and decides it's probably a good time to get back to the bus, but the bus has engine trouble, so he's gonna have to spend the night since it won't be repaired until at least morning. And you just know that they're gonna have to get the part shipped in, and it's gonna take like 4 to 6 weeks for delivery. The narrator is unhappy, but with little choice decides to take a room at the Gilman house, which, come on, that is super on the nose for these people that are trying to keep the fish people stuff hush-hush. After an uneventful dinner at the hotel restaurant, the narrator retires to bed and, like the previous night, cannot sleep. But for a totally different reason, not anticipation, but abject terror, as he hears people trying to get into his room, although people might not be the right term, because the inhuman noises accompany the attempted break-ins. Although isn't he gonna look silly when he finds out it was just complimentary room service? The narrator thinks quickly, though, and plots an escape through adjoining rooms to get to a roof with a way to descend down to the street, which I've got to give him credit for. He is much better in a crisis than I am. I don't think I'd be clear-headed enough to have that wherewithal to formulate that plan. His escape is mostly successful, evading the Dagonites, and uses the map to navigate uninhabited areas to escape his pursuers, and heads for the disused railroad headed out to the town of Rowley, and finds refuge in a hiding spot, but, against his better judgment, looks upon his pursuers and sees the true horror of the fish people, with grayish-green skin with white bellies, shiny and slippery with scaly backs and prodigious bulging eyes that never closed, gills and webbed hands. Now, I don't know if we're just desensitized in the modern day, but I don't really find that all that horrifying. It mainly just reminds me of The Shape of Water. I should probably finally get around to watching that. It did win Best Picture, after all. Seeing them causes him to faint, and when he awakens, he's safe and able to make his escape to Rowley. He somehow finds the strength to finish his tour of the surrounding area, and finds some genealogical records from his mother's side of the family, and hears about an uncle of his who also sought out those same records, but ended up committing suicide because of what he'd learned. In the case of his grandmother's family, the records are rather sparse and are connected to a Marsh family, but not the more prominent ones from surrounding states. I can imagine that you've probably already figured out where this is going, so I won't beat around the bush. Yeah, the narrator is half fish people, on his mother's side. But before the narrator comes to terms with this, he returns home to Ohio to recuperate from his trip and causes the government intervention that I mentioned back at the beginning. After a year, he finally goes into a deep dive on the family records and comes to the conclusion that he's descended from the Deep Ones, and another uncle shows him heirloom jewelry in a safety deposit box that matches what he saw in Innsmouth. His life returns to normal for some time. He gets a job, he lives his life, until dreams of the Deep Ones start to haunt his nights, and he finds himself starting to gain the Innsmouth look himself, and realizes that his uncle killed himself to stop the transformation into a Deep One from occurring. The narrator considers that himself, but he can never bring himself to do it, and remembers a cousin locked in a sanitarium who greatly resembled their grandmother, revealed to be alive and living under the waters of Innsmouth with the other Deep Ones, who he resolves to break out and take with him to join their ancestors in the waters of Devil's Reef. as the story ends. The Literary Lair will return, but first, a word from our sponsor. Obviously, we love print media here at Black Scarab Films, but we also love books in all of their forms, including audio. I'm a fairly recent convert to the world of audiobooks, first when it provided me a way to read books during my commute, despite not having a free hand to turn pages with. And now, I've found audiobooks very useful for doing other tasks that would have usually prevented me from indulging in my favorite pastime, like when I'm folding laundry, cooking a meal, or even walking the dog. Gotta love multitasking, right? Which is why it's so fortunate that this episode is sponsored by Audible.com. If you love books and want to find a way to read more even when you don't have a free hand, audiobooks are the way to go. And if you like my channel and want to help support my videos, you can go to this link, audibletrial.com/BlackScarabFilms, to get a 30-day free trial and 1 free audiobook. My personal recommendation this month is Doctor Who: The Ghosts of Innsmouth. Written by Barry Letts and performed by John Pertwee, Elizabeth Sladen, and Nicholas Courtney, it's one of the radio dramas that paved the way for Big Finish Productions, and features one of the final performances of John Pertwee as the Doctor before his death. It might not be totally appropriate for Halloween, but it does feature the third Doctor, Sarah Jane Smith, and the Brigadier fighting ghosts in an Italian castle, so it's at least partially fitting for the season. But if that's not your taste, there are literally thousands of audiobooks on Audible, so I'm sure you'll find something to your liking. Happy listening, and that link again is audibletrial.com/BlackScarabFilms. Lovecraft is always a tricky read for me, although I say that I've only read 3 of his stories, but I've had this issue all 3 times. It's very dense in a very specific way. The words aren't confusing, but the text doesn't flow in what I feel is a very natural way. There's not a lot of dialogue. The story is mostly told in action prose, and any speaking is typically a character telling a secondary story, which makes the already dense story a little tougher to parse. It's very telly and not showy, if that makes sense. It's not like, quick, over there, character A said, over where, character B said, character A gestured wildly at the shambling monster. It's more like, character A said, quick over there, and character B responded, questioning what they'd meant before character A pointed at the shambling monster. It's not poorly written, and I admit it just might be a me thing, but I found myself having to reread a lot of the pages because my eyes just started to glaze over during certain passages because they ran on for so long without any reprieve. And I admit, I'm a little disappointed in where it went. I was expecting the narrator to be driven to madness and sacrificed by the people of Innsmouth for being an outsider who would tell their secrets, not turn out to be revealed to be a deep one himself. I don't know, maybe I'm an outlier, but I feel like the story's beginning doesn't quite seem to fit with how it closes, at least in my humble opinion. It seems like a sudden twist, and I feel like I'd enjoy the story more if it was the story of an outsider learning too much, rather than an outsider turning out to be an insider. It's very, the call is coming from inside the house, which I frankly find to not be as interesting as an outside force. And the Zadok Allen stuff, while I think having it be written entirely in his own ramblings to the narrator and the reader at the same time is a great way to utilize it in the narrative, having it be written in the dialect of Zadok Allen, which uses misspelled words to have a sort of old prospector sort of cadence to it, does make it a little hard to read, and I had to stop and reread a lot of words to figure out what they were meant to be. It's also a pretty long story. As I said earlier, it was rejected by a magazine for that very reason, and I can see why. There are long swaths of the book that are just descriptions, and factoring in my previously stated problems with Lovecraft's style being very difficult for me to parse, that didn't make this any easier for me to read. But I'm not the only one with criticism of the story, because Lovecraft himself was very critical of it. He said that it has all the defects I deplore, especially in point of style, where hackneyed phrases and rhythms have crept in, despite all precautions. I'm not sure if I think it's necessarily hackneyed, but it's not his best. But that's not to say that there aren't positives to it. The story is edge-of-your-seat exciting once it really gets going. That chase through the hotel and into Innsmouth was written very well, and had great pacing. It's just a shame that the rest of the story ebbs and flows differently, and doesn't really have a steady pace. I don't really get a sense of real depth from the characters because they're never really truly present, but the narrator feels like a wholly realized person, and his descent into madness as he discovers his ancestry is well written and satisfying on its own, even if I feel like the narrative as a whole is not. I particularly like how when he references having bought an automatic to kill himself with, he says, "No, I shall not shoot myself. I cannot be made to shoot myself." As if the person he used to be was, well, just that, a different person, since he wasn't choosing to shoot himself, but being made to. I don't know, I just found that line to be particularly awesome. And obviously there's tinges of racism, if only just in the mention of the tribes of the Kanek, and I feel like there's an argument to be made of the Innsmouth look and the interbreeding of the Deep Ones and the humans to have some connection to the idea of interracial marriage, but I might be stretching for that because I just expect racism when I read Lovecraft. At the very least, there's only one uncomfortable racial comment made that's obvious on a surface glance, so it's about the same as Call of Cthulhu. All in all, I think The Shadow over Innsmouth is a good story, but Lovecraft will probably never be one of my favorite writers. If you like eldritch horror and Lovecraft and somehow haven't read this one already, I think you'll probably enjoy it. I do recommend it since it's a pretty influential story for the Cthulhu mythos and it's one of the big ones. But be forewarned that it's not really an easy read and it's fairly lengthy, so be prepared to be in for a long haul, particularly if you're reading it and expecting to finish it within a few days to rush a video in the production. Not that I did that or anything. But I also think it's a pretty good introduction into the world of Lovecraft, and I think it might actually be slightly better than the Call of Cthulhu, which I don't remember much from, but I think that I might have had an easier time with this than I did with that one. I remember that video was a lot tougher to write than this one. But as I said earlier, this is just the appetizer for the Halloween offerings this year. Come back on Halloween for a new episode of BlackScarabFilmZ Presents, where we'll be looking at a film with both a connection to a famous horror author and one of my favorite sci-fi franchises. I'll explain later. See you next time. Never did find a joke for, I take lungs now, gills come next week.